Superhero fatigue. The act of being tired of superheroes. I often hear that superhero fatigue is a myth, that people can't become tired of superheroes. Historical precedent tells us that superheroes have been popular for so many decades that they'll probably continue to be popular for a few more decades. Superheroes will probably continue to be popular, but that doesn't mean that superhero fatigue is a myth. It's probably happening right now. I feel like a lot of people assume that superhero fatigue means that one day Marvel fanboys and DC fanboys and Snyder fanboys will just wake up one morning and be done with their favorite characters. But superhero fatigue, at least how I interpret it, doesn't refer to the super fans. It's the general public that's going to get tired. When movies like Avengers Endgame were breaking box office records, it wasn't because the superfans' enthusiasm was just so great it manifested these ticket sales out of nothing. It was the average film goer that gave it its success. A vast majority of the people who go and see these movies are not comic book readers. They're not MCU experts, and most of the people that saw Batman v Superman don't even know who Zack Snyder is. Fandoms, in my experience, have a lot of difficulty identifying what the average person actually knows about their fandom. As surprising as it might sound to some of you, most people that saw the last Spiderman movie probably didn't know that this guy directed Iron Man. To most people, he's just been the funny, silly dude who gets to bang Spider-Man's mom. Like, people talk about Shazam 2's poor box office reception, and they blame it on the fact that James Gunn is rebooting the DC film universe. So the storyline set up in this movie won't matter, and that causes them not to go and see the movie. And that is just one of the most out-of-touch things I've heard in a while. Most people who saw Shazam 2 or Shazam 1 or any DC film has no idea who James Gunn is, or that he's rebooting the DC film universe, or that there even is a connected DC film universe. The level of investment that most people have in these kind of movies is minimal at best. But with that said, you have to recognize that it's not the super fans who are carrying these films to break $1 billion. It is the average person. It's your uncle, or your grandma, or your mailman, or anybody that still asks you whether Batman is an Avenger or not. These are the people that take a franchise like the MCU and make it the most popular film series in the world. So it's only when the general public is sick of Marvel, when they're sick of DC, that's when superhero fatigue has set in. And I think we're at that point. The history of superhero films is uninteresting, so I'm not going to talk about it. You can't argue that 1978 Superman launched the superhero film genre into prominence, because while it itself was a successful film, its sequels were not. Supergirl was not. Same with 1989's Batman. There was a lot of isolated film franchises, a lot of superhero movies, but none of them were the top films of the year. We really have to look at the X-Men and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy to see this advent of the modern superhero age. But even then, I think people forget how quickly things spiraled out of control. Almost immediately, every studio wanted their own Spider-Man, and most of these films made were terrible. And pretty quickly, we started getting into this subversion and parody territory. Like, the tropes of these films were already growing tired by this point. And in 2008, well, we saw a bit of that subversion. The Dark Knight surprised everybody by being good. But what's more surprising is the next most successful superhero film of the year was not Iron Man, but Hancock. That's right, Hancock made more money internationally than the first Iron Man, which, while a surprise hit, was not a mega hit. In fact, the MCU was not the biggest thing on the planet when it first launched. Films like Captain America and Thor weren't close to being the most popular films of the year. And in 2011, some people were convinced that superhero fatigue was already setting in. This movie, The Green Lantern, lost a lot of money. It's a joke. It's embarrassing. And this was surprising to WB, I assume, because Green Lantern is one of the more recognizable DC heroes. Some people thought that maybe fatigue really was just setting in. And not that this was just a terrible movie. For the next year, you had The Dark Knight Rises. You had The Amazing Spider-Man. And most importantly, you had The Avengers. Now, this film is, of course, what really got the MCU into the public consciousness, the cultural zeitgeist. I've heard people say that the superhero genre is like the Western, and it's going to go out like the Western. If you don't know, the Western was a genre of film that dominated Hollywood for decades and slowly lost popularity over time. It started to fall into this subversion and parody before people just quit caring. But I don't think the superhero film is like the Western. The Western was based on nostalgia. People actually lived during the Wild West. Some of these young cowmen who fought in these real cowboy battles could see these movies when they were old men, recounting their heroic achievements. People went to the movies a lot more back in the day because TV didn't exist. It was a terrible time to be alive. So something like the Western was of course going to take off. The superhero genre is not this. I think a more fair comparison is the young adult novel adaptation craze. Stuff like Harry Potter, or Percy Jackson, or Twilight, or Aragorn. Everybody wanted their own The Maze Runner, until they didn't. And I think if not for the success of The Avengers and The Dark Knight Rises, then the superhero genre would have mostly faded away around 2012. A fad that would come to its inevitable conclusion. But obviously it didn't. And it wasn't just because the MCU, the DC EU took off with exceptional films like Man of Steel. But it was a lot more than just this that really made superhero movies explode. There was world trade agreements that were made between the Americas and China. After this point, not all films, but some of the big Hollywood blockbusters would now be allowed to be shown in Chinese theaters. And this was a really big deal at the time. Now, if you don't know, China has a lot of people, a lot of Chinese people. And some of those Chinese people like to watch movies. Most of the time, they're Chinese movies, but sometimes they're not. And this meant a whole new market to appeal to. A whole new way for Hollywood to make money. But there's a problem. China isn't America. You can't have certain offending materials in films. I don't know all the rules, but I know you can't have ghouls, or goblins, or ghosts, or gays, and you definitely can't have all of them at the same time. This means that studios had to play by China's rules or risk getting banned in the country. And as a whole, most companies have started to realize that this country isn't a safe bet for capitalistic growth. And this has had some effects on Hollywood. After Avengers Endgame, Marvel movies were banned in China for a few years. Stuff like Shang-Chi, The Eternals, Black Panther 2. Disney bet big on Disney Plus. Put a lot of money into this. Lost a lot of money on this. It has not been a huge success, but Marvel bet everything on Disney Plus. After Endgame, the entire MCU became this interconnected series of films and TV shows and streaming specials and holiday specials. And the problem is, most people don't give a shit about Disney Plus. Yes, the super fans tuned in every week for the new WandaVision, or Loki, or Captain Falcon. But just based on math, we know that most people didn't see Miss Marvel, or She-Hulk, or Iron, or Newhart, or Night Court. But we started seeing this divide in the MCU fan base of people who actually watched the shows and people that didn't. Doctor Strange 2, in my opinion, is a real turning point for the superhero genre. It's when the average film goer lost their interest in the MCU. Now, if you don't know, in this movie, the character of Wanda is the bad guy. Now, Wanda, before this point in the Marvel movies, was not a bad guy most of the time, but this change in character was set up in the show WandaVision, and Doctor Strange 2 was in many ways a continuation of that series. But the problem is most people didn't watch WandaVision, so none of this made sense. They just saw Wanda and she's gone crazy. For the average filmgoer, they started to view the MCU as sort of this scheme to push Disney Plus on people. I mean, now you have to do your own homework. You gotta watch the shows. You gotta sign up for the monthly fees. If you wanna enjoy these movies to their fullest extent, you gotta watch more things. People didn't want to do that. Thor 4, complete disaster. One of the worst films ever made. And this is when you start seeing more people talk about superhero fatigue. I mean, because this is lame, right? Like, I don't think I'm that cynical, but this is very lame. I'm embarrassed by looking at this, and I have to imagine other people were too. Black Panther 2 did not make as much money as the original The Black Panther. Now, that could be because it didn't have, you know, the Black Panther, but it could be because of China. I think a lot of people don't seem to know that just because a film's box office exceeds its budget, that does not necessarily mean that the film made money. There's a lot of other costs that aren't calculated into the budget, like marketing or distribution or something else I don't know about. But it's usually accepted that a film needs to make about 2 to 3 times its budget back to just break even. So keep in mind when you look at the numbers for Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, that this movie lost a lot of money. This was an important film. It was the first entry in Marvel's Phase 5. It was going to set up the big bad villain Kang, who would appear and fight our favorite heroes in the next Avengers movie. Now, he was already set up in Loki, but nobody saw that, so they had to do it again in this movie. But nobody watched this movie either. It was a box office disaster. Now, it was important that a lot of people saw this film, and a lot of people did not see this film. And that was concerning because Ant-Man is one of the few remaining popular characters in the MCU. I mean, who else do they have? And you can't blame China here either, because the film released in China, and nobody saw it there either. After this, you have Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which did pretty well, I guess. But that was to be expected. This was gonna be a decent film. It's the end of a trilogy of characters that are not usually closely tied to the MCU, and it's the final James Gunn film for Marvel before he moves to DC. So its success is an outlier. Also, I haven't seen this film, but I'm assuming it's the end of the Guardians. Maybe they all die. I don't actually know. I didn't get that spoiled for me. But this can present problems, especially for Marvel. Because what do they have coming up? Sure, Spider-Man is doing well. Spider-Verse 2 did well. Spider-Man 2, the game, will do well, but that's not owned by Disney. That's owned by Sony. And Spider-Man is an outlier. But the rest of what Marvel has is not going to fill you with confidence. The next Marvel movie is The Marvels. This is a continuation of 2019's Captain Marvel, starring Captain Marvel, and characters that were introduced in Disney Plus TV shows. Now, this movie's not going to make money. Captain Marvel might have made $1 billion, but that's only because it was released right between Infinity War and Endgame, and a lot of people assumed it was necessary viewing for that finale. I mean, this film could be a good movie. It could be the best movie ever made, but it's not going to make money. I'm sorry. Same with the Thunderbolts. I don't think the Thunderbolts is going to make a lot of money. Captain America 4. Anthony Mackie's back for more. See, here's the issue. And no, it's not that he's black. I already know that Anthony Mackie's black. It's the fact that Disney, you would have needed to see Captain Falcon and the Winter Man to even know what's going on in this movie. Most people are just going to be confused why Captain America is still alive, because he died in the last movie, and now he's black. He's a black guy. Like, if they got confused about Wanda, this is gonna really throw them off. And looking at the other stuff like Echo, a spin-off of a show that nobody saw, Agatha, unless Armor Wars is about Don Cheadle fighting Terrence Howard for the role of War Machine, I don't expect anybody to tune in. I'm not convinced that most of these projects are actually getting made. And actually, I think Disney has a good opportunity to not make them right now. With the failure of Ant-Man Quantumanium, there's a real chance that every upcoming Marvel project will lose a lot of money. Now, if I were Disney, if I was a sneaky little boy like Bob Iger or Kevin Feige, I would just say, well, the writer's strike has presented some problems for us. So we're not going to make these movies, and we'll come back in 5 years with X-Men and Fantastic Four. As for DC, it's over. I don't think WB's making it, like, the next 2 years. I'm pretty sure they're getting bought out by Comcast. But even if they aren't, if James Gunn actually does reboot the DC universe, I don't think people are going to show up. The Flash was the litmus test for DC to show that nobody cares anymore. Now, maybe it's partly because of Ezra Miller's legal troubles. He did do some pretty truly horrendous things. But considering that WB leaned so heavily on the Batman in the marketing of this movie, I don't think it matters. I think people are just sick of superheroes. I'll write a better script next time, I promise.